Hi, I'm Chris Fitzgerald, and thanks for joining me for this new subsection of the jazz-based video technique series. This section of the series focuses primarily on the music of J.S. Bach and the suites for unaccompanied cello. And I've been wanting to do this project for a long time for a number of reasons, but in the interest of time, I'll list two reasons at this point. The first is really simple. I feel like the cello suites are some of the most beautiful, melodic, single-line music ever written, and I can't imagine anybody not wanting to study them, and it makes for a very motivational practice experience. And the second reason is, over the years, in terms of intonation, technique, and articulation study, I feel as though I've learned as much or more from studying the suites in terms of those three aspects as I have from all of my jazz studies combined. They've challenged me and made me a better player. And through studying them and working out the difficulties involved in the various pieces in the suites, I feel like I've become a better player. And I wanted to share that with other aspiring players who are looking to become better players. The series is half-jokingly called Bachrilege, but only half-jokingly, because there are a number of people out there who are very dogmatic about how certain music should be played. Some of those people might be Bach scholars who feel that Bach should only be performed in the period style and on period instruments. And some others might be bass pedagogy folks who feel that the bass, to truly practice the bass, you must practice it primarily with a bow. And my point is not to contradict either one of these groups, but basically just to add another perspective. And that perspective is this, that if you see yourself as a player who is very serious about your music and you want to become a better player, and the end result of your playing, the end format of your playing is likely to be pizzicato style, playing with your fingers, whether it be jazz or folk or whatever music you see yourself playing, then it really behooves you to take the study of learning technique and articulation with your fingers seriously, and to practice music which hopefully will force you into dealing with situations that will make you a better player, and that you can then carry those techniques out with you into your regular musical life, as I have done over the years. And I can think of nothing better to practice for intonation, technique, and articulation than the cello suites. Well, the study of the cello suites by double bassists is certainly nothing new. Double bassists have been studying this music for many years, usually with the bow. And lately, it seems the normal way to do this, or the popular way to do this now, is to play the suites in the same range that the cello plays them. So a bassist playing the suites at pitch, which is what it's called, would be playing them with the bow way up in thumb position, because the bass sounds an octave lower than it is written. And there's a number of really amazing performances of bassists studying playing the suites way up high, trying to sound as much like a cello as possible on the bass. The intent of this series, though, is more for people who are looking to learn the main register of the bass, the lower register of the bass, what might be considered the money register by a lot of people, and to play the suites in the lowest register possible, to develop a voice on this area of the bass primarily, where most of us play most of our music and provide the foundational role in the ensembles that we play with. So in this series, each installment of this series will feature a different movement from one of the suites. And so the video will include a performance of that movement, and that performance will be arranged in a particular way to showcase and highlight various techniques and articulations which the music seems to call for. And you'll see what those are when you see the very beginning performance clip of that video, as you did in the beginning of this video. And then later in the video, you'll see sections of the piece discussed and dissected so that each of the performance aspects, techniques, articulations is talked about in greater depth. Also, for the videos that are especially in the beginning of the series, you will find there will be a PDF file that you'll be able to download for free, which will show one page which just has what I call the naked score, as it is in the Ortext edition of the suites. Just the notes and the rhythms arranged with, in the proper range for the bass. Then there will be a second page which includes the articulations and techniques which were included in the original performance at the beginning of the video. In other words, an arrangement of the suite to sound that particular way. And then finally there will be a third page which includes not only the articulations and the techniques written in, when to do a hammer, when to do a pull, when to do a rake, that kind of thing, when to play staccato, when to play legato, but also includes fingering for every note of the suites, or every note of that movement of the suite. So thank you for tuning in, and I hope you enjoy the rest of this presentation. Well, the notion of giving a brief synopsis of the importance of articulation in music is a very daunting one, because that's a subject that could go on for hours and hours and days, and these videos are already long enough. But I'd like to start by focusing on the importance of 2 points about articulation. First, articulation is important, and it's the idea that the way you play a piece of music is almost as important or even more important than the piece of music that you're playing. And second, that articulation is universal. Articulation that you learn in one style of music is not limited to that one style of music. And so whenever you spend time working on a piece of music in one style, you always take something back from that study of that music in that style whenever you play music in other styles and other genres. So articulation is important, and articulation is universal. Let's start with articulation is important. Articulation is the life that is added to the notes and the rhythms by the performer. And it's what makes the music breathe and ebb and flow. It's almost as if it is the art that brings the science of the music, the notes and rhythms, to life. And to illustrate this point, I'd like to play a couple of short excerpt examples both ways. The first is the Gigue, which is the subject of this video. In the beginning of the video, it was played as an arranged version with certain types of articulations and dynamic range and dynamic contour and all of that, and it sounded a bit like this. Etc. So everything had an ebb and a flow to it and was sort of brought to life by the performance, which was basically dictated by the dynamics, the contour, the articulations, and the techniques which brought those to life. If I take all of those things away and just play the notes and rhythms, it sounds a little bit like this. Etc. You get the idea. It basically takes the life out of the music and makes it this big, flat, sort of grating monotone. So articulation is incredibly important. It's what brings the music to life. The notes and the rhythms are just a framework for which we then imbue our own voice into the music. And articulations are universal. So the articulations that you learn in one style transfer onto another style. If we go to jazz and think of a melody that jazz musicians would know pretty well, Charlie Parker's Confirmation, the beginning of that melody, as we normally hear it when it's played in an articulate manner, sounds a bit like this. Has an ebb and a flow like the Bach did. It has a flow, it has a contour, it has dynamic range. it has a tone, which is set by the performance. So like with the Bach example, if we take all of that away and just play the notes and rhythms of confirmation, it would end up sounding more like this. And it sounds kind of robotic and monotonous and pretty grating to the ear. So again, how we play is as important and sometimes more important than what we play. Arguably, and I'll speak for myself without speaking for anybody else, arguably I would rather hear a great performer play a bad piece of music well than to hear a bad performer play a great piece of music badly, because the great performer is going to at least bring that music to life, where a bad performer is kind of doing the opposite to what could have been a great piece of music. And every time we study a piece of music, we should sort of think about, how are we bringing this music to life? How are we imparting our own voice to this music? As a final illustration of this point of the importance and universality of articulation, I'd like to finish with an example, not from music, but actually from prose and from the theater, language, basically. It's not limited to music. The same principle works equally well as a language example. So to give this example, I've got my iPad here, and I have typed in the words to Hamlet's great soliloquy from Shakespeare, which, as you know, is often this epiphanal moment in the performance of Hamlet, and the thing that great actors look towards. So this is where they're really going to sum up the height of their performance of Hamlet. And so instead of, for copyright reasons, I can't show a great performance of Hamlet by a great actor, especially considering I'm not one. But what I can do is show a really bad reading of Hamlet by a software program. So think of, if you've ever seen Hamlet, think of great performances by great actors of Hamlet's soliloquy, and then compare them to this version of Hamlet, which is going to be performed by Siri on my iPad.
To be, or not to be, that is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing end them, to die, to sleep, no more, and by a sleep to say we end the heartache, and the thousand natural shocks that flesh is heir to. 'Tis a consummation devoutly to be wished, to die, to sleep, perchance to dream. Aye, there's the rub, for in that sleep of death what dreams may come when we have shuffled off this mortal coil, must give us pause.
And with that, we're going to give this pause, and certainly give Siri pause. It takes something which could have been magnificent, a bad performance takes something which could have been magnificent, and when all the articulation and all the humanity and the art and the life are taken away from it, and it just becomes the words on the page as spoken by this monotone, it goes from something which could have been inspirational and tremendous, and turns it into something which sounds more along the lines of ludicrous. I originally was going to use an excerpt from Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech, but the moment I heard Siri do it, I couldn't bring myself to do it. So we went with Shakespeare instead. But anyway, it does underscore the point of this segment of the video, which is that articulation is important and articulation is universal. Before we move forward in our discussion of articulation and the specific techniques that relate to each type of articulation that we use in these particular arrangements of the suite movement, I'd like to take a moment to talk about the idea and the notion of dynamics and dynamic contour in performance practice. Obviously, dynamics and dynamic contour are an incredibly important part of any performance of any piece of music. I think you'll notice, if you're looking at the score of this arrangement of the Gigue, that there are no dynamics on the score whatsoever. And the main reason for that is that in Bach's time it was not customary to write dynamics on the score. So if we look at, this is the Urtext edition of the score, if you look at this, you won't see a single dynamic indication in the entire thing. At the time that he wrote these pieces, it was customary for the dynamic contour and the dynamic decisions to be left up to the performer, and also dictated by the performance practice of the time. If we were doing music by a later composer, Beethoven, Brahms, etc., there would be dynamics on the score. But I like to leave that open to the interpretation of the performer, so you will not see any dynamics on the score. So as we move forward talking about articulations, it's not that dynamics are not considered, but rather that they are left up to your own discretion as you decide to phrase this music. Moving forward into the forms of articulation and the basic physical techniques that we use to produce them, we break down articulation into two basic categories. The first is legato, and the second one is staccato. Legato being connected, and staccato being short or disconnected. So the connection between notes, either it's a smooth connection or it's a broken connection. With legato, we first have to take into account the way that string instruments normally produce legato. If you look at most string scores, you will see slurs over short sections of notes. And in most string scores, those slurs represent bowings rather than actual phrase markings. And it means that the bow is used to connect the notes together, so that if you play 3 notes under one bow, ba-da-dum, the bow will keep the string vibrating and automatically connect those notes when you move your fingers under the same bow stroke. With pizzicato playing, we don't have that option. We don't have the bow to keep the string moving, and so we have to look at the idea of legato and staccato slightly differently. There are lots of different ways and techniques to produce legato, pizzicato style. There are hammer-ons, pull-offs, rakes, etc. But the most basic form of legato is just what is called articulated legato. Articulated legato simply means connecting a line even though you are articulating each note of the line with the right hand. And while it might sound like a bit of an oxymoron, articulated legato, it actually isn't when you get right down to the musical result of it. So let's talk about articulated legato. For articulated legato, the entire purpose is to connect the notes in the aural sense, so that you hear no break between the notes. And it's a technique that involves both the right and the left hands, because either the right or the left hand can stop the sound of the note and produce an aural, or the illusion of a break between the notes. So if I play with just the right hand and I play on one string, I'll use the D string, and I play like this with enough speed and velocity in the stroke, it sounds like the notes are connecting right into each other. But if my stroke isn't fast enough and I stop the finger on the string before going through the string, it'll produce the effect of a note and then a brief space and then another note. And that's how the right hand can either produce or ruin an attempt at articulated legato if the stroke is fast enough. It will give the illusion that the notes are actually connected straight through one to the other. If the stroke is too slow, it breaks the line, and so you hear note, space, note, space, note. Similarly with the left hand in articulated legato has to connect the notes one to the next as smoothly as possible by making each note as long as possible. If I play a 1-octave scale in the key of G, and my left hand does not keep the weight on the board even if the right hand is doing a fast enough stroke, the left hand can ruin the effect of that legato articulation by not staying connected to the board. true legato articulation, articulated legato articulation, would sound. So when examining your attempts at legato, is something that I always do. If I hear a recording of myself playing and I was going for legato, articulated legato in this case, and I hear on the recording that I didn't exactly get it, that there were some breaks between the notes that I didn't intend, one of the first things that I'll do is to go back and break down which hand caused the break to happen. You can do that by isolating the right hand, so if I'm playing that scale, and that sounds connected and smooth and connected by itself, then I'll take a look at the left hand and say, okay, it must be there. Oh, there it was, right? The left hand didn't stay connected to the board, and for that reason, the legato effect was broken. So again, articulated legato means simply right hand, enough velocity so that there's no break heard between the strokes as each note is articulated, and the left hand, connection to the board so that one note connects directly to the next. Now I know that this arrangement of the suite that the Gigue of the suite that we're working on in this video is not written that way in the score, but I want to play the first phrase of the Gigue as though everything were to be completely legato and what we're now calling this articulated legato style. And it would sound like this. And so that covers the basic concepts having to do with articulated legato. In the next section, we're going to look at some of the other concepts, hammer-ons, pull-offs, and rakes, which are ways that pizzicato players can further explore legato concepts without the use of the bow. In addition to the general articulated legato discussed in the last section, there are three other techniques which pizzicato players often use to produce a legato sound: the rake, the hammer-on, and the pull-off. The rake is sort of a special case, and we're going to deal with that one in this section. The rake is actually a form of articulated legato, meaning that each note is articulated by the right hand plucking the string. However, with a rake, there's a difference, because we said in the last section that you make right hand legato by having enough velocity and speed in the stroke so that when the finger hits the string, it doesn't produce a break in the sound, and that if that stroke goes too slowly, that it breaks the sound. So in the last section, we said everything, when you did articulated legato in the right hand, that you had to keep that velocity in the stroke. Well, the one exception to this is the rake, and the rake is what happens. It's a technique that happens when the right hand moves from a higher string to a lower string, and instead of having to create a new stroke to restrike the string, when you go from a higher string to a lower string, you play the higher string, the finger comes to rest on the lower string, and it's already in a position to play, so you don't have to remove it and then come through the string again. I rake from the G to the D, it's ready to play, I simply pull through the D. And on the score, this will be indicated by a small slur between the two notes and the indication R, which is shorthand for rake. So in the first section of the Gigue, the score, if you're looking at the score, the first section shows the first phrase, the first line of the piece it goes like this. It's a combination of staccato and legato, and there are 3 rakes built into that phrase, and I'd like to examine those so we can sort of know what we're looking at when we go further into the score and you're looking at what do all these little R's mean. It's just a form of articulated legato. So in the very beginning of the phrase, we go from the G to the D. We rake from the G down to the D, stay, keep our finger on the D string, and then instead of restriking, we just pull through. So the very first part of the phrase, there's the first rake. The second one comes between the E and the C. Again, we play the E, right hand finger is resting on the A string here. I finger the C in the left hand and just pull through with the right hand. I don't need to make a separate arm motion because the finger is already in a position to play. And because this higher string is ringing, it'll give me that connectedness, that aural connectedness that we want when we're trying to play legato. So up to this point, the phrase goes like this. Or rake, rake, rake. And there's one more in the phrase, and it's where we go from the B to the G. So the first phrase would go rake, 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 and it continues on. So when you're looking at the score and you see the notation R, it's shorthand for the word rake, and it's just a specialized form of articulated legato where you don't have to create a second motion of the right hand to play the second note of a raked phrase because the finger's already in a position ready to play. In the next section, we'll look at 2 very related techniques, the hammer-on and the pull-off. The next articulation to consider is the hammer-on, which is a technique most of us probably know either from playing it on the double bass or from playing bass guitar or even from playing guitar. It's a legato technique, and while we may be familiar with it from other instruments, it's slightly a different animal on the double bass, so it's worth discussing. On the score of the Gigue, it will be abbreviated with an H for hammer-on, and again it shows a small slur connecting 2 notes. In this movement, I've tried not to use a hammer-on to connect more than 2 notes for reasons that we'll talk about shortly. Hammer-on is one of the most aptly named articulations in the world because it does exactly what it describes. You play one note and then use your finger as a hammer to knock the string down, to hit the string down, and let the second note stop without having to re-articulate it with the right hand. In the opening section of the Gigue in the first line, there are 2 hammer-ons on the first line, so we'll keep our discussion to those, but then branch out from there and talk a little bit about things particular to most hammer-ons on the double bass. So when talking about rakes, we finished with the first 2 bars. Next 2 bars, the third full bar has 2 hammer-ons in it. And they lead us into a discussion of things that are particular to most hammer-ons on the double bass. We know that it's the technique of the finger actually hammering down the string and producing the sound. But if you've ever done this on a guitar or even a bass guitar, the amount of force needed to actually make that note sound on a double bass is much greater than it is on a guitar or a bass guitar. And so while it is possible to keep this sort of fixed position in the left hand, it's easy to fail to generate enough force to really make the note sound. If you're going to use hammer-on as a legato articulation technique, it's important that the second note, the note that is hammered, doesn't come out as much quieter than the first note so that you're actually able to sound like you're making a legato articulation where both notes are roughly of equal volume and they really sound like connected notes in a phrase. So some things to think about when doing a hammer-on. It's just like if you've ever watched a carpenter work, a good carpenter if they're hammering in a nail, can do it in 1 or 2 strokes, because they take the hammer, bam, and they're able to bring the hammer a good distance back, and they let the weight of the hammer do the work for them. So a good carpenter puts the nail in place, raises the hammer up, lets the hammer fall. They're not forcing the hammer down, they're letting the hammer fall. It hits the head of the nail, and a really good carpenter can get that nail in 1 or 2 strokes, whereas someone like myself who doesn't have carpentry skills, especially when I first started, would put the nail in and I would go tap, 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 and I would kind of be trying to push with my arm and bend the nail and all of that. Well, on the double bass, it's a similar paradigm. When you're playing the first note and getting ready to hammer the second note, you have to be a certain distance away from the string in order to generate the force to knock the string down, to hit the string down loudly enough so it'll sound. If I'm too close to the string, or if I'm a little further away, it benefits us to use arm weight rather than finger strength to do a hammer on. I can do one with finger strength, but if I'm really only using my fingers to make that hammer, it's more like that tap, 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 tap I described a minute ago when I was first learning to hammer nails. To get a really proper hammer on, where the second note actually sounds reasonably loud and connects to the first note, you need to have some weight behind it, and you need to have a little distance for the finger to travel so that weight can generate momentum and slap into the string, hammer into the string with enough force to make the second note sound. And where I really think of hammer-ons as coming from is from the shoulder and the arm, so that instead of me trying to use the small muscles of my hand, I'm actually letting the arm fall and carry the finger with it. So in hammer-on technique, it's a legato technique, and what you're really trying to do is to drop the weight of your arm through your finger. Let your arm motion carry your finger to where it needs to play, and drop all of that weight onto the next note that's about to play. So in this passage, there are in this suite movement, there are hammer-ons all over the suite, and you'll see them with H and a slur. But it's a good idea to practice hammer-ons as just part of a scale study. So if you were playing scales up the G string, for instance, you might do 2-note hammer-on groups just to practice that technique. And again, the things to remember, the biggest thing to remember is to use the weight of the arm and the motion of the arm to produce the force to hammer the string down to make the sound loud enough. In the next segment, we're going to look at pull-off technique. The last legato articulation we need to cover in this installment is pull-off technique. And pull-off technique is indicated in the score of the Gigue by the letter P over a 2-note grouping, a slur showing a 2-note grouping. Pull-off technique is like hammer-on technique in reverse. Hammer-on was a 2-note ascending grouping where the right hand articulated only the first note and the left hand created the articulation for the second. Pull-off is a 2-note articulation, a descending 2-note grouping, where the right hand plays only the higher note and then the left hand articulates the lower note. Unlike hammer-on technique, which has a very descriptive name, pull-off technique, the name can be a little misleading. Because if you take 2 notes and you simply pull the finger off the string, the second note doesn't have much of an articulation and doesn't produce much of a sound. When I describe this technique to students, I usually describe it as pluck sideways technique, because it's much more descriptive of what happens. Rather than just lifting the finger off the string, I'm actually going to pull sideways and pluck with the finger. And so that's a better way to work on articulating those sounds. We said with hammer-on technique that it was useful to practice little scale fragments. And it's just as useful to practice pull-off technique going the opposite direction. A couple of things to notice about pull-off technique. The first one is that it's not as clean an articulation as hammer-on technique is. In other words, it's a lot easier to get a hammer-on technique to sound than to sound properly with the second note actually being loud and a viable articulation than it is pull-off technique. Another thing to remember about pull-off technique is that the sound tends to be a little, if you don't execute this technique properly, the sound can be a little nasal and a little thin. So to execute this sound properly, we always talk about, with technique, trying to bring the technique into the larger muscle groups of the body. Well, with pull-off technique, it can be done with the fingers. But you notice it gets a very nasal sound when you do it just with the fingers. And same with a 4-to-1 pull-off. Just using the fingers, it's not enough force is generated to really get a good sound as compared to moving the entire arm. So the way that I like to approach pull-off technique is to set the hand in position and then to move the entire arm mechanism back and just pull this finger along with it so that it's actually performing like a plucking stroke as the right hand would do. And same for the 2-1 pull-off. And you focus on the movement of the elbow there. And when you compare them directly, hand with no arm motion, hand with no arm motion, with arm motion. I think the results are pretty apparent. Well, in this movement, the Gigue of the cello suite, there are pull-offs all over the score, and I'd like to focus on the third line of the score where there are about 4 of them in close proximity. The passage at close to normal speed goes something like this. And the 4 pull-offs in there are F to E. Then there's a Rake, pull-off from A to G, B flat to A, and then F to E. The most difficult of those to do is the pull-off to the open string. Because the pull-off to the open string tends to sound, the open string itself tends to sound different from the stop string. And so if you're not careful, it'll sound really whiny and nasal, and so that's something to work on. For the last articulation of this video, we'll look next at left-hand staccato technique. Well, up to this point in the video, we focused almost exclusively on legato articulations. We've looked at articulated legato, rakes, hammer-ons, and pull-offs. In this last section of technique information in this video, we're going to look at the idea of staccato and the technique involved with left-hand stop staccato. Staccato has come to mean in music just basically short, so that when you see a dot over a note, you play the note short and disconnected. So if legato means connected, staccato means disconnected. But if we only say that a dot means short, we're leaving out a lot of information, because how short should a staccato note be? Probably the greatest teacher I've ever had, Doris Kais, my old piano teacher back from undergrad and school, taught me a lot about staccato, and her definition of staccato, when I asked her, what's the difference between staccato articulation over a half note and a staccato articulation over a quarter note? And she said that for practical purposes, what she went with was that a staccato articulation means that the note is exactly half as long as it is indicated, so that a staccato dot over a half note would indicate sound for a quarter note and silence for a quarter note. Likewise, a staccato dot over a quarter note would equal sound for an eighth note and an eighth note rest. In the Gigue that we're looking at in this video, all the staccato notes are over eighth notes, which means that if we're going basically 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, that we don't just want to go and play those notes short. We want to play those notes exactly half as long as the eighth note would have been. So if the eighth note is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, we want to subdivide those eighth note beats into 16th note pulses, meaning basically taka, 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 taka. And then when we create a staccato note for that eighth note, it would basically read like a 16th note and a 16th rest. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And notice how the staccato at that tempo, the eighth note at that tempo, is a rhythmic staccato, so that it just doesn't sound, it sounds dutton, 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 dutton. And it actually, in that way, with the staccato being rhythmic, it fits the music. So that the music, rather than sounding like this, which sounds very kind of choppy and unsettled, would sound with rhythmic staccato like this. In which the staccato actually becomes a part of the rhythm and therefore becomes a part of the phrasing. Well, while there are actually two different techniques to produce staccato on pizzicato style bass, this movement only utilizes one, so we're going to talk about that one, and that is basically left hand stop staccato. To produce the staccato, the right hand doesn't have to do anything. The right hand simply has to pluck the note. The left hand rests on the string after the note is played to basically play a rest, and it can happen no matter which finger is playing. It's easiest on an open string because you can rest all four fingers on the string, but it can be done. So you'll notice that when I'm playing with the first finger here, I play the note, relax the hand, release the note, and then these fingers come rest on the string. Likewise with the second finger. And then again with the fourth finger. And again, fourth finger staccato isn't that bad either, because while the fourth finger is playing, these other fingers can already be resting on the string, so that when the finger is released, the string automatically stops. So we're almost done. I'd like to play the very first section of this phrase with rhythmic, articulated left-hand stop staccato. So you can just sort of hear what that sounds like as we're thinking about this topic. Well, we finally made it to the end of this very long video, and if you've made it this far in however many sittings, you're a real glutton for punishment, but thank you for sticking around. This initial installment of the series is sort of an exploration of ideas that I've wanted to do for a long time. It's very much a thing in flux, and I'm going to request that anyone who sees this section, anyone who has anything to say, please weigh in with your opinions on the nature of the series, the Bach etudes, what you find useful, what you don't. The comments section of the video would be a really excellent place to do that, but there's also you feel free to contact me directly. In this installment, we covered a bunch of techniques which were written into the score. Legato techniques, general articulated legato, rake, hammer-on, pull-off technique, and also left-hand stop staccato technique. And the Gigue movement was chosen because it's arguably the easiest of the suite movements from the first suite, and the one which has the shortest little bursts of articulation, especially the way it was arranged, so that it's a good entry point into working on the cello suites pizzicato style. In future installments of this series, we'll be working on different movements from the suites. They'll probably get increasingly more difficult, and since a lot of these preliminary techniques will have been covered in this video, in those future installments we'll be able to delve further into the idea of specific fingerings and treble spots and musical phrasing and the musicality of the suite performance itself, and some basic performance practice. But I'd like to thank you for joining me for this installment. Please do give me any feedback that you may have, either in comments or personally in email, and hope to see you for future installments.